Welcome back, everyone, to the Disaster Tough podcast, where we share insights into the big plays and right calls of leadership. We dive deep into the stories, lessons learned, and ideas that will help you in the field. Let's go. Welcome back to the Disaster Tough podcast. I'm your host, John Scardena. I am so excited for this week. I have Lieutenant General Jeffrey Buchanan. He's been all over the globe helping out different things. He's done several tours overseas. We're going to be talking about that a little bit. Since he came back to the States, using all of his experience and understanding, he's been involved with hurricanes and wildfires, everything from understanding security at the Capitol all the way back through helping it now in leadership, different roles there. And so he could talk about his background. But Jeff, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks, John. It's an honor to be able to join you today.
You know, so we were talking fairly briefly before the podcast, and you were walking through some of your experiences for me. I was writing down notes like left and right because you've done so many different things. And just for the sake of the audience, before we kind of get into the things since 2019, can you walk through our audience, kind of your background and how you became Lieutenant General? Sure.
I spent 37 years in the Army. Initially as an infantryman, served in most continents, all but Antarctica, I guess, when I look at it. But over the last, what you'd find most interesting is probably, the last 15, 20 years of my career. 4 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. And my last job in the Army was I was a commander of U.S. Army North, which is the Joint Force Land Component Commander. So the guy who focuses on land domain operations for North America. And in that regard, I did Homeland Defense, but also responsible for what we call defense support of civil authorities. And that's what brought me into being the military commander in support of FEMA in different states for 5 major hurricanes. There were Matthew, Harvey, Irma, Maria, when I deployed down to Puerto Rico, and Florence in North and South Carolina. I did Southwest border security, wildland firefighting, and plus earlier I was a Joint Task Force commander in support of multiple entities for national special security events like the State of the Union address. Hopefully that gets to where you want to go to.
Yeah, in fact, it's kind of funny as you're walking through the different hurricanes in particular. Probably a lot of people are laughing on the show because I've talked about Hurricane Matthew and Hurricane Harvey almost ad nauseum. Those two were like my capstone events when I was on the FEMA IMAT West. Matthew, we prepped for a type 1 catastrophic hurricane, and then it kind of skirted up the coast of Florida and went back out and then hit north pretty hard. But it wasn't a Cat 5 hurricane. It wasn't a type 1, but we prepped for it. So it was kind of funny. And then Hurricane Harvey was kind of on the other end of that spectrum for me, where it was by far the biggest disaster event I had ever been to, and a lot of innovative ideas that we had to come up with. So the fact that it just shows how big these events are. The fact that you were there, the fact that I was on the strike team, all those pieces coming together. When you think about the differences maybe between Hurricane Matthew and Harvey and the resources required to be able to do these different events, what are some of the things that, from my side of the house, the emergency managers really have kind of no idea about the military perspective? What would make their jobs, how do I say this? What can they learn to help military personnel be more effective in their jobs? What can we do better?
Well, I think probably the most important thing is to just be upfront and honest about what you need. Sometimes the military has some tremendous capability and they can provide something, but I wouldn't fall in love with the solution. Let me just give you an example. If you're asking for a company of, military engineers, whether they're Army sappers or Navy Seabees, because you want their bulldozers to be able to clear a path on a street that has telephone lines and trees down, you're falling in love with the solution instead of the requirement. Because what I would do as a military leader, first I would look for, hey, do we have any contractors that own bulldozers that are in this area? And if so, it's going to be a heck of a lot cheaper to all of us if we use those contractors. Plus, we're going to be putting that money for the emergency response back into the people who actually need it locally.
Yes.
So, but saying, here's my requirement, and then let us in the military try to find the best possible solution. And it may not be a military solution. But do you mind if I go off a little bit on Harvey
Please.
and Irma and Maria?
Yeah, I'd
these
love
three
to.
all happened in summer of 2017. And so first you had Hurricane Harvey. I had she was an Air Force weatherman. My weather officer at the time said you could tell that Harvey was a man because he wouldn't stop and ask for directions. This hurricane came ashore, then went back offshore, picked up more energy and came back onshore. It did that 3 times. So it dumped more than 60 inches of rain on Houston and Beaumont, Orange, Texas, all that southeastern Texas. That's 5 feet of rain. So Harvey was a really bad flooding event, which you may remember. And we brought in a lot of military resources in support of both FEMA and the state of Texas. But it was all about unity of effort. How can we work together to help the people who are actually in charge, both FEMA and the state and the incident commander, to get the job done? And it was only about a week later that Irma came into the Caribbean, hit U.S. Virgin Islands, and then went up the coast of Florida. And so we were ending our military support on the Harvey response and got redirected to Florida, for there. And that worked pretty well. But again, very different event, very high wind event. So different kinds of damage. And we were able to provide what the state needed, which in this case was a bunch of trucks and truck drivers. They needed from us on the federal side to help move people around. And then 10 days later, Maria. And here's the real problem. Maria was fundamentally different. In fact, my worst hurricane was Maria. And part of it was because of the hurricane itself, but part of it was you had all these resources from FEMA applied to Harvey, and that was ongoing. And then Irma happened, and another group of resources went there, but the response and recovery effort was still happening when Maria hit. So now the cupboard was pretty bare. In fact, all of the disaster supplies that FEMA was keeping in the Caribbean had been pre-positioned on Puerto Rico, but when Irma hit the Virgin Islands, it all got sent there. Yeah. And so, there's some other things. Both Texas and Florida had, they're 2 of our richest states. They have incredible emergency management capability. So the national response framework worked the way it was supposed to. We, the federal government, were in support of them. They clearly had the lead, and everything worked pretty well. Yeah. In Maria, the director of the Puerto Rican Emergency Management Agency went on vacation day 3 after landfall and never came back. So on the, and FEMA's cupboards were pretty bare. So when we got there in the military, I knew, that the system had broken down and we were going to have to behave unnaturally. And I'll just give you a quick example. I had 72 aircraft, helicopters and Ospreys under my command, 4 ships, about 15,000 troops. The way the system is supposed to work, we're supposed to get requests for aircraft support. But, there's no communication lines. All the cell phone towers are down, even microwave antennas. There was no ability to communicate on the interior of the island. So I knew we weren't going to get requests, and it was never going to happen that way. So instead, I directed all of our pilots, load up with all the food and water you have, and just go find people that need help and start pushing supplies, because we're not going to wait to be asked. And even for our medevac guys, I said, fly in those medevac helicopters, and when you land and you push out food and water, have your flight medic get off board and go find a doctor or nurse and see if they need medications, see if we need to evacuate somebody.
Interesting.
Because the radio system was down, cell phones were down, so we were going to have to behave unnaturally.
The L3 Harris Extreme 400P radio solves problems and is specifically designed for emergency services. How do we know? We field tested it with medical, urban search and rescue, and collapsed and confined structures. This radio is amazingly tough. Check out the L3 Harris Extreme 400p radio at l3harris.com right now. How do you spell Doberman Emergency Management? EOP, OEP, HVA, HMP, Thyra, TTX, Drone, PDA. Whenever you need an expert, Doberman Emergency Management field experts are there for support. Contact an expert at DobermanEMG.com today.
CBRNE Convergence, the world's largest conference for the non-conventional threat, is heading back to Orlando between October 28th and 30th, 2024. With 3 days of workshops, lectures, and interactive sessions delivered by speakers from around the world on the latest issues and approaches to CBRNE and HAZMAT. Make sure to claim your early bird discount by registering now at cbrneworld.com/event/Orlando.
There's Maria is one of the, so how do I say this? There are many disasters that go very well, and there are many disasters that have challenges. And I try not to be hypercritical of any of it from either side. I try to learn from it and see what we can do better. From the civilian side, from FEMA side, there is a reason why the team was fired. There was a reason why my team that was in Texas, we worked really well during Harvey. Harvey is still geographically the largest hurricane landfall and or hurricane disaster in U.S. history, and it barely makes the news compared to Michael or Katrina or those ones because it went so well. If you contrast that against Maria, the civilian side was also incredibly slow. They didn't understand the problem set of logistics on an island versus on CONUS and getting things sent there. And so, from hearing... I always heard all these stories. This is wild to me. I heard all these stories about military just jumping in there and trying to help out and providing supplies, which overcame this massive supply chain deficit because they weren't ordering fast enough. And the fact that you were the guy on the other end. I've always heard all these stories about that. Puerto Rico, oh my gosh, they just didn't understand emergency management. They thought the feds were going to come in and save them. They didn't have any systems set up. The FEMA teams were slow. The supply chain was broken. The comms were broken.
But you talked about, either whether it's federal government or state to state, EMAX, they didn't have the capability there because the airports and seaports were all shut.
Yeah.
So, and they're 1,000 miles offshore of the closest U.S. city, other U.S. cities. So it really did compound things. And I had to learn, okay, I'm here to support FEMA and the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. And every day I met with the FCO, the Federal Coordinating Officer, and the governor to make sure we had priorities straight. But in a lot of ways, sometimes I was leading from the bottom, if you will.
Yeah.
I'm here to support them, but look, here's what we can do. Here's what I think we need to do. And let's get on board and start making things happen. But I also had to learn.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
One of the things was critical for me is we had to do some things that were counter to military culture. And so, my belief is, first of all, we are in support. We're not in charge. And so we got to work with the people we're actually supporting.
Yeah.
Secondly, we got to balance patience with anticipation. In the military, it doesn't matter whether you're, a Marine, an airman, a sailor, a soldier like me. We all reward this behavior where you should rush to the sound of gunfire. We're going to jump right in and make a difference. And what I found in working with natural disasters is we can rush to stage and get ready and be able to close that last mile, but we better be pulled in by whoever's in charge instead of push our way in. So if you think about it like a big inner city fire, if they called for a bunch of soldiers, we could load up on trucks. But if we drive all the way up to where this fire is, all we're going to do is block it so the fire trucks can't get in. We got to wait and get pulled in and controlled by the incident commander. I think that's really important. So it's balancing both anticipation and patience.
I really liked Craig Fugate's methodology of go big, go fast, and pull back. The thing about the military, some people, you're talking about the solutions versus the requirements, and it's funny that you bring that up. We had kind of a learning curve back when I was in FEMA about stop asking for like the cool helicopter and start telling them what our actual problems were and see if they could figure it out for us. And when we did that, we became much more efficient. The other thing is just the cost is astronomical. I don't think people understand the cost of a helicopter, $9,000 an hour for just the fuel, right? Plus the staff, plus all the other stuff. So those things really compound.
Well, when you look at at least half of those helicopters that I had on Puerto Rico, we flew inside of C-17s.
Really?
Some of them were based off of ships, but we flew like a whole company of medevac helicopters from the 101st Airborne Division out of Fort Campbell, Kentucky. We flew up inside of C-17s to get down there quick.
That's awesome.
You start adding up those costs, they're tremendous.
Yeah.
And cost isn't a factor when you're saving lives, but it becomes more and more a factor, as you're moving in towards recovery.
In the emergency management response for dynamic populations course, you'll master the art of managing large, diverse populations, like those at schools, hospitals, amusement parks, or stadiums. These scenarios demand rapid, adaptable responses where command and control, evacuation, mass care, medical transport and triage, public messaging, and counter-sea-burn considerations are all put to the test. From October 22nd through 24th in Pueblo, Colorado, you'll dive into DIPOP training with the capstone Hot Mess Express exercise, taking on the role of an emergency manager as you lead your organization through chaos of a catastrophic train derailment. This high-intensity experience will push your skills to the limit as you work to protect and coordinate these ever-changing populations. Get ready to elevate your readiness in the most complex dynamic environments with DIPOP 2024. Class size is limited. Sign up today at thereadinesslab.com.
Right at the end of like the response phase for Harvey, which would have probably been around the same time that it was starting to cap off from response for Maria, the wildfire started kicking off in California. We had like the Mendocino complex, and we had some like the Santa Barbara wildfires. We had some of these other big ones. From your perspective, from this 50,000 foot level perspective, you're able to see supply chains. You're able to see these movement of resources, and the requests that have to come in from either the government or from the governor or from the president, whatever. I constantly wondered during that time because I was brutally exhausted, right? Like just done. And yet you have to keep going because people are getting impacted. And so you just, suck it up, drink a Red Bull and keep going. At the same time, I kept on wondering how many more simultaneous disasters could a country take before we're really starting to get nervous about supply chain and other stuff like that. From a planning perspective, when you're looking at 3 major hurricanes happening at the same time, or several years before that when they had the 4 major hurricanes hit, Florida in 1 year. What do you think that we are missing that we need to start addressing now? Is that interoperability piece? It's logistics. I'm kind of sick of the 72-hour kit mindset. I'm not really a doomsday prepper. I don't know if it's really helped. From a national security level perspective, what do we need to start doing as professionals to make sure that we are continually resilient?
Well, I think it's people need to be willing to do whatever it takes, regardless of what their job description is, regardless of their mission of their organization. When we start to get into significant emergencies, you got to roll up your sleeves. And so, again, from the military perspective, and you look at all the different types of units we had these ships down there, we had helicopter pilots, and, we had expeditionary hospitals. Let's just take expeditionary hospitals. We have these things for combat. And the reason we have a military is to fight and win our nation's wars. I mean, that's why we exist. And so if you think about our expeditionary hospitals, well, they have a lot of trauma capability and everything because they're there for combat. But when we're going to go and redirect to deploy, to a U.S. state or territory, in this case, Puerto Rico, because of a disaster, then we got to bring in some OBGYN. We got to bring in geriatric capability. We got to bring in some things as part of this expeditionary hospital that we may not normally have. And so I think that applies to any agency, any organization. What can we do to help? Don't worry about who's in charge.
Yes.
This is one thing I used to hate. Is one of our principles of war is unity of command. And if I was king of the world, I'd throw that in the trash in a second. I think we need unity of effort. It doesn't matter who's in charge. What can you do to help solve part of the problem, even if it's only from your perspective? How can you lend a hand and help? Wildland firefighting is a good example. We have a niche capability in the military. They're modified C-130s that can be employed, to help fight wildfire. But what we used to get called for quite a bit was providing ground crews.
Yeah.
Now, I've got a son who's a hotshot in the Forest Service. And those guys, that's a Type 1 interagency hotshot crew. In fact, he's on a fire right now in Idaho. They're doing direct attack and everything else. That's not what we were asking for soldiers for. We weren't asking them to be a hotshot crew. But we do need them to help reinforce by, cutting fire lines on the edge or the perimeter of a fire, or doing logistical support and everything else. So we got this whole process that we work with the National Interagency Fire Center. And the sweet spot starts happening in August and September. Is really the time to start worrying, because that's when fire season tends to be really bad. Plus, you got a lot of these ground crews are going away because kids are going back to college. So what happens is the demand goes high and the capability goes down. That's when they start asking for military support. And then we have a very specific training process where we bring in, 250 troops or 500 troops or whatever the requirement is to work as ground crews in support. It's of directly the National Interagency Fire Center, but it's usually a federal entity like the Forest Service, not a state entity like CAL FIRE.
Man, it's fascinating to hear your perspective, because I've worked always on the civilian side, and we will request those resources, and all of a sudden they show up, and you kind of wonder how that happens. And shout out to a lot of my military buddies who I've met over the years who've been, great liaisons, and yet the systems that are happening behind the scenes that I don't think a lot of people get to see very often, and how all those cogs work together. Funny, you brought up the OBGYN thing. Tomorrow I found out the gender of my third kid, so I'm pretty excited about that.
Good.
So,
congratulations.
yeah, thank you. I tried to do that on a previous podcast, by the way, and my wife's like, "You're not telling people yet," so I had to edit that out. So I think I can tell people now, but
well, it won't be long. It won't be long till he or she is drinking all your beer. Trust me.
Yeah. Well, my kids are growing so fast. I'm like, I don't know how it's possible, but that's for another time. Going back on this topic though of like national security and trying to get to the next level of like readiness and trying to overcome what I would call stupid. There's just a lot of stupid waste that we can overcome. You were involved with understanding, or at least doing assessment, a gap analysis potentially after January 6th. You're looking at the Capitol. You have a security and an intelligence perspective all the way through that hurricane. You just intimately talked about Hurricane Maria, for example, and all those different problem sets. That's a pretty big scope of understanding. At the time of this recording, this is going to come out in several weeks. There was an assassination attempt on the former president. There's a lot of things happening right now. We're essentially in a couple different proxy wars with what's happening in Gaza. I'm all support on taking out Hamas, so I don't care what everybody says, but you have that, and you have what's happening in Ukraine right now. There's a whole lot of happening, a whole lot of complexity, a whole lot of tension. And I keep on thinking everybody's perspective is myopic, just so short-sighted. And I'm trying to figure out how to, from a professional standpoint, you look at protests that are happening on campus all the way through a January 6th event to different events. I don't have the magic sauce, right? Like, I don't know or have a monopoly on how to reduce tensions. But I think it puts us in a really dangerous position. How do we pull back from dangerous positions when so many things are happening simultaneously? What are your thoughts on that?
Wow. Okay, that's kind of a wide open question, but let me get at one part of it. Right, let me get at one part of it. I'm concerned right now because of all the divisions and personal attacks and things like this that we have ongoing right now in our national narrative and our national dialogue. And I'm not here to provide a recommended solution on, well, we need another political party, we need to go to ranked choice voting, whatever the case is. But I think right now we're so divisive, and the American people are just tired of not seeing Congress perform and govern and legislate, but instead fighting amongst each other, that it is really concerning. I don't think it's all just natural. I don't think we naturally got there. I think that, honestly, there's a pretty big hand of Russia and China, in particular in information operations, or, entering the net and posing as an American on various social media platforms and doing things that cause more and more angst and more division. And it's sometimes it's wrapped around elections, sometimes it's wrapped around other things. So it's a big concern that I have. The real concern is about this division and how people are identifying themselves as a member of this party or that party, or I don't trust these other people. They see these other people as the enemy instead of as fellow Americans who just disagree. So I unity. I am adamantly nonpartisan, and I don't want to say I don't care who is elected, but whoever is elected at whatever level, I really hope and pray that they will fight for unity and figure out how to bring us together. Now, Interestingly, I don't wish for this, but it seems like when we have, national critical events, think about 911, that tends to actually unify us. We tend to be able to set our differences aside. I hope we don't have to go through that or something like that again. But it's, I'm sure the same thing was true for the attack at Pearl Harbor. There was a lot of division leading up, but after it happened, then we figure out how to work together. I hope we don't have to go through that, but somehow we got to get unified and leverage the things that make us great as a country instead of highlighting our differences. So I am concerned about that. And it's not just a natural event. Our adversaries are playing a role.
We had the director of the Urban Warfare, National Center for Urban Warfare, Chris DeRuiter, on here. And we also had the executive director for West Point's Urban Warfare on here. And they both talked about information warfare and China and Russia's capability in that, as well as the DEA just being on here and talking about what China's trying to do with fentanyl and trying to hurt our culture.
Manufacturing of all the precursors that they're shipping.
Exactly. Yeah, all that whole problem, right? So the Five Eyes of urban warfare are coming into play right now in our country in a big way. And it's funny. My mom and I have this good joke. Well, I want to say it's a good joke. My mom always complains about like people posting stupid stuff online. They don't know where it's coming from. But then she goes on and posts like the obvious like thing that is like doctored all the way. And so like, Mom, you just did that. But like, I think it's hard for people, especially when they get emotional and somebody says something that just picks at that emotion a little bit, to not be able to step out and say, wait, where did that source come from? Who is providing that? Why are they providing that information? And, I really appreciate your thoughts on that, because it's the divisiveness is, we talk about like active shooters on here, and we talk about different problem sets, like, economic or otherwise. And I think those are all symptoms of something much darker. And the darker is the divisiveness, that cultural shift that's happening where people can't trust each other anymore. They don't want to trust each other. They're going to outside sources. And from an emergency services standpoint, I tell this to people, like, whether ethical or not, I can track your nationality, your religion, your organizational affiliations, all this different stuff. I can't track if you get angry, right? Yeah. From a law enforcement perspective, like, and that gross narcissism level where people are starting to hurt each other because they're unhappy, that's a huge problem. And I don't know. It sounds ridiculous and naive and maybe weak, but I do think I think kindness goes a long way, and people kind of need to go back to the basics a bit. I don't know. Those are just...
Yeah, I agree with you. And in the meantime, how do we deal with violence or potential violence? I'll tell you, I'm a big fan of, I did some training for, I'm a volunteer range liaison for a sheriff's department. So I went through law enforcement training and, got pepper sprayed and everything else. So Had a lot of fun with all that stuff. But probably the most valuable thing that I've learned was de-escalating conflict and de-escalating violent situation. And some techniques coming out of a book called Verbal Judo and things like this. And yet, we're all victims of our own experience and culture. Now, I grew up as an infantryman. Obviously as a leader, I want to de-escalate conflict, but I just didn't employ it the same way you would do it as a high-risk traffic stop. I didn't understand that, and so when they first said, well, yeah, you got to ask questions, my very first instinct was, well, what the heck is your problem? Okay, well, that's the infantryman coming out.
Yeah.
But that's not a trained law enforcement professional.
Yeah.
And so I'm still a work in progress. Don't get me wrong. But I can't unlearn 37 years of entering and clearing a room or entering a French with a grenade or whatever.
Yeah.
And so, but I need to, if I'm going to be helpful rather than hurtful, I need to understand, how do I lower the temperature to a conversation and things.
Yeah.
And I'm just one example, but I really encourage anybody who's a first responder at any level. I don't care if you're an ambulance driver, really understand this, because like it or not, that level of anger and heat and everything is out there. And what we don't want to do is exacerbate it.
Yeah. There's a time and place for everything. And sometimes there really is a place for anger, and that needs to be utilized in certain settings. But most settings, it honestly doesn't. Like most settings, I tell this to, funny enough, to my kids. I'm like, you get to choose what matters. If somebody's been a jerk, you get to choose if that is actually a big deal or it's not a big deal. And, like I said, just going back to the basics, it's the same thing with hurricanes. People get to choose in a Hurricane Maria if they're going to go all in and participate and help out, or they can choose to go on vacation and tap out, right, 3 days into the event. And I think it's probably so unpopular nowadays, but just buck up, suck it up is probably a pretty good term that we all need to remember.
I'm a huge proponent of the ancient Greek philosophy of Stoicism, which was brought about in a number of different things, but lots of great authors have been a part of this. But, one of the big ideas is this: you can't control what happens to you, but you can always control how you respond to it. And so, hey, maybe your neighbor's going to be a jerk. Okay. How do you respond? You throw gas on the fire, or do you just try to diffuse it, or do you ignore it? There's what are you taking? People are going to hurt you. Okay. How do you respond to that? And, that should be your voice and your control, not somebody else's.
Yeah. I like that. And if you're going to be petty, make it fun. That's totally true, though. That's funny. Well, General, I don't know if I should approach you as General or just call you Jeff, but
call me Jeff.
Yeah. Jeff, thank you so much for talking to me. I want to have you come back on, especially as we go further into hurricane season and we talk about these different concepts. The things that we're talking about today are no small topic. Every one of them probably could be talked about and should be talked about truly ad nauseum, especially the national security level complexities that we're dealing with right now. I'd love to have your insights back on after the election. Hopefully we're still normal as a country. And, for a guy, and I say this publicly, so you don't have to, I hate both sides. So if you want to run for president, I'll be happy if you did it. I'm not 90 years old yet, so I can't run. But either way.
John, can I say one more thing? Look,
absolutely.
I didn't mention this when we were talking beforehand, but I do mentorship work now. Every year with FEMA, they bring me in to talk to their IMAT, emerging leaders within the IMAT team.
Oh, awesome.
And I have a blast doing it. But it reinforces what I see as a critical nature of what you have done and what others have done. Most people in our country have no idea what FEMA does for them, or what their fire department or what our local police department does for them every single day. But I want to thank you all for what you do, even if you're never thanked by anybody else. So thanks for you. Thanks for all that you've done, and thanks for your years of service.
I appreciate that. And for everybody who's listening, who's just grinding away without that, thanks. I'm sure that they totally appreciate that as well. Hey, if you got something out of this podcast and you have a question for Jeff, you can send us an email at contact@thereadinesslab.com and we can forward it on to Jeff. If you want to continue the conversation on social media, on LinkedIn or Instagram or Facebook, wherever, make sure you put it out there, especially if you've been to one of the events that both Jeff and I apparently were at that I didn't get to meet him at. But he's a cool guy, and we appreciate his perspective again in this time. So with that, we'll see you for the next one. Peace.